So last week we spent some time in the book of Judges facing the repeated verse, the Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And we saw how in response to the continued tragedy of Israel's rejecting God's rule, how God raised up judges to bring deliverance over and over again, even though the deliverance was only temporary. We also saw how these deliverers were often not the kind of people that we might expect to rule. My intention, moving forward, was to spend the last week in the Judges and then cover that time period in Hebrew history. And then move on to the era of the kings, beginning with King Saul. But I was paging through my Bible, the best laid plans, you know. As I was paging through my Bible, I passed the book of Ruth on the way. And now Ruth is a very familiar story for most of us. And it actually takes place in the time of Judges. So I thought with how popular the story is, I might hop over that book and go into 1 Samuel, which is where we learn about the time when God gave Israel a human king. So I flipped past Ruth and I started reading 1 Samuel again. And I had to stop because 1 Samuel starts not with the kings, but with the birth of Samuel, who was the last judge and prophet for Israel. And I've talked about the call of Samuel before, but I really didn't spend too much time on the circumstances of his birth, which, like the story of Ruth, is also an incredibly familiar story about the everyday, ordinary lives of people who might not get much of our attention, except that they exist in such a pivotal time in the Bible. But as I was reading through that book again, I had to pause and question why these two stories about two seemingly insignificant people were placed back to back in our Bibles. Because if we believe that this is the inspired word of God, and we believe that what we have here, we have for a reason, then the placement of the books, the flow of the entire story, when it's put together, is ordained. It's ordained that way, and it should be given an opportunity to speak. I also came to the realization as I turned again and again back to those pages that I think that there's somebody here this morning that needs to hear this. Maybe more than one person. So while we're continuing our series to better understand the gospel message and how to communicate it, this morning I'm speaking to the person or people who need to hear this. Because it's a very particular story about hardship and how God invests in ordinary people who happen to have extraordinary faith. So I turned back to the end of Judges, the very last verse, and I remembered that here is what, in my opinion, is probably one of the saddest verses in the Bible. Judges 21:25. Uh-oh. Are we dead? Oh, there we go. In those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. No, that's not good. I think at first when we read this verse, we think of it as just telling of the circumstances, which are sad. Israel had no king, and we tend to leave it there. But when we look beneath the surface to the reason why they had no king, we realize that up until this time, they had been living in a theocracy, a form of rule where they relied on God for direction and law and as a source of their justice. In other words, God had been their king. This means that the state of having no king means that they essentially had deposed their king. With every decision to step away from the God who had rescued them from oppression, they had begun the shift away from faith in the God of their ancestors. And the inevitable tragedy that takes place when we remove God out of the center of our faith is that that place of honor doesn't stay empty, does it? We fill it by putting faith in other things like our circumstances, our money, or our jobs. Or we replace God with the faith in ourselves and our abilities, or faith in the people who surround us, or even faith in our ability to control our world through the governments we create. So even before the time Israel would ask for a king, they had already replaced God on the throne with other things in their hearts. Each did what was right in their own eyes. We know from last week that the era of the judges is a dark time, with Israel constantly looking this way and that, but rarely up, unless things were really bad. They were dealing with the consequences of living in a land that had not been completely conquered. And while they knew that the God of their fathers had been a powerful God, when you're hungry and losing battles with your enemies, even if it's because you didn't do as God had asked you to do, that power is quickly forgotten and other gods creep in. So there was no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Right back to the Garden of Eden. Right back to grabbing the fruit off the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In reading the book of Judges, we know that Judges failed. The judges failed to deliver Israel. And we know Israel was once again in a kind of trouble they couldn't fix without the Redeemer that we're now waiting for in this story, aren't we? So we turn the page and expect to begin reading of God's change in tactics, the era of the kings. But there's this pesky, beautiful little story that stands in the way of our expectations. And if we're so bold to skip it, we end up with another pesky reminder in a little story at the beginning of 1 Samuel that has nothing to do with victory or triumph or the pomp and circumstance of enthroning kings who would serve Israel. These stories are domestic. They're ordinary. They're full of everyday suffering. They're about women who lived in a time when they were not provided an education, so their value was based largely on what they could give to the people in their immediate circles, what they could provide for their families. These aren't big epic stories of entire civilizations. They're stories of the individuals who called on Yahweh out of the pain of their circumstances. But this shouldn't be a surprise, because we serve the God who wants a relationship with us. So it makes sense that we're given these little stories about everyday pain and suffering in the midst of battle scenes that decide who would rule what piece of land. You see, God moves his people in the large scale to where they need to be as he moves through the world, toward redemption. But he doesn't forget the individual on that journey. Psalm 56:8 reminds us. I think you're going to need to flip through these for me. You have kept count of my tossings. Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your record? Wow. You have kept count of my tossings. Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your record? Sometimes it's easy to forget, but the God who made heaven and earth, the God who put galaxies into motion, is also the God who collects the tears that fall when we can't perceive the good in our hardships. So it makes sense that our Bible has these huge stories about the development and movement of civilizations, but those stories are punctuated every once in a while by these reminders that God works in every corner of our days. So we're going to spend time with Ruth today, with this beautiful little story that leads us straight to Jesus. And it does so in multiple ways, but today we're going to look at how it calls on us to understand our God as a personal God. So we're going to wade into the story and let it speak to us. We're going to respect that this story is here for a reason, that we're going to pause here because if God chose to place this little story about the hardship of one family between God's plan to rule through the voices of the judges and the eventual solution of the kings, then there's something here for us that we need to leave with today. So let's open to the book of Ruth. It's only 4 chapters long, and once we begin reading it, the first thing that you'll likely notice is how its structure is very different from much of the rest of the Bible. It truly is a story. We don't have time to read it entirely, so I encourage you to pick it up this week and read through it from beginning to end. Now, we've talked before about how we tend to approach the Bible with the intent of finding instruction or with a purpose in mind. But as I read this first chapter, I encourage you to simply listen to the story and let the characters and their tragedies speak to you on a personal level, because that's primarily how we're supposed to read this story. We're supposed to be drawn in so that we empathize with the characters. So this time I'm not going to put it on the screen. I'm going to do it a little different. I mean, I can't stop you from following along if you want to, but I'm just going to ask you to listen though. Ruth 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the other was Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them and wept out loud. They wept out loud. They said to her, "No, we'll return with you to your people." Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters. It has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Then they wept out loud again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." When Naomi saw she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. So the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Call me no longer Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. How many of us have said this? I went away full, but the Lord brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned together with Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, who came back with her from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. That's the end of chapter 1. So opening this story, we're faced with 2 interesting facts. First, Ruth doesn't seem to be the main character. It's really a story about Naomi. But the writer has gone to great lengths to highlight her, which is interesting in another way as well. Right from the beginning, we're told that Ruth is a Moabite. She's not Hebrew. So we have an ancient book that we know was read in Jewish circles along with the other scriptures. And the person who the book is named after, thank you. The person who the book is named after is not even Jewish. This means that the book was remarkable to early readers and worthy of its inclusion in their readings. And it appears like a breath of fresh air right after the corruption and violence of Judges. So we're going to start at the beginning with Naomi and her husband Elimelech in the time of the Judges. One of the first details is that they're in the promised land and they're dealing with a famine. That should stop us immediately. Because the promised land was the land that was supposed to be flowing with milk and honey. And they're in Bethlehem, a place named for provision. The name means house of bread. So we start right away with this tension and the contrast between our expectations for the promises of God and the reality that the Israelites are not living in the blessings that had been promised to them. We read that Naomi and her husband decide to go to the country of Moab. This is another tragedy, or maybe it's simply a continuation of the last one. They're fleeing from the land of God's provision to the place that should have been conquered but wasn't. Then Naomi's husband dies, and their sons choose to marry Moabite women, which again is a step away from what was supposed to be taking place when the Hebrews entered the promised land. If the family were following Hebrew customs, they would probably not have pursued marriages because the Moabites worshipped a foreign god. And since in these stories the blessing of children is so closely linked to God's favor, we can see that the fact that neither of these Moabite women having children of their own, even after being married for 10 years, it's a subtle statement that Naomi's family was living outside of the security of God's favor in a foreign land. And then tragedy strikes again. Both of Naomi's sons die. And she and her daughters-in-law are all that's left of the family. And if we haven't already begun to, here's where we begin to relate to Naomi. Because she does what we often do, and she becomes who we become when circumstances move beyond our ability to understand or contextualize or find an explanation for. She makes the decision to return home. Her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, also decide to follow her back to Judah. But Naomi, at this point in time, is in the place most of us end up when tragedy strikes. She isn't looking forward. She isn't going to Judah because she has any hope that things will be better there. She's not going there with the hope of finding a new family or a new husband. She's going there because she's broken and she's seeking the familiarity of her people and her God. This isn't a brave move. And I don't think we could even call this a desperate move with a solid hope of finding relief from tragedy. This is a move of practical faith. Things hadn't worked out. And the famine that was in Bethlehem might be over, so Naomi's going home, one foot in front of the other. And we know this because she begs Orpah and Ruth to turn back to their people and homes. In essence, she's releasing them to remarry. They don't want to, though, so we're given this sense that Naomi must have been a good person. She must have been a source of comfort for her family. She must have been wise and trusted because her daughters-in-law, even in their tragedies, want to stay with her instead of returning back to their people. And finally, Naomi laments that God has turned against her. Now, this is interesting. There's some commentators who point to this as evidence that Naomi really didn't know her God anymore. And that instead of looking at the contributions that she had made to her own tragic situation, moving to Moab, allowing her sons to marry Moabite women, she sought to take the easy road out and blame God. I don't agree with that reading. And while I can see where they might be coming from, Naomi lived in a time where she might not have had much access to the people who really did know the God of Israel. And I don't think that the punishment that she verbally lays at God's feet is really how we're to read it, with a sense of blame. I think instead, this is simply reality. It's real life. This is that moment when things are falling apart and we say, what did I do to deserve this? How many of us have ever been there? And I think this is just a picture of humanity. And we can go back and forth moralizing about the source of her comments, deeming them right or wrong. But I think in doing that, we've missed the point. She's simply despondent. She's lost everything. Women of this time didn't have a source of income outside of their husbands and sons. They didn't have Social Security or retirement plans. Their only real value to society was based on the families that surrounded them. And she doesn't even have that anymore. Through immense personal loss, she was in a position of absolute destitution, both financially and personally. But her faith makes her put one foot in front of the other toward the land that had been promised by God. If she really blamed God for her pain, she wouldn't be going back. But then Ruth responds to the loss they had all experienced with beauty. The rhythm and poetry of her words are largely diminished in the English translations, but she vows in a stunning display of self-sacrifice. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. And this is one of the reasons why I don't think Naomi was really speaking about her God as the one who actively punished her. You see, on the heels of Naomi's honest and heartfelt lament about the God that she feels, that it feels like he turned away from her, Ruth, the Moabite, makes the decision to embrace that very God. When Naomi was honest with her struggles, with how she understands her faith, with her confusion over the hardships of her life, this is when Ruth connects with her to the point where she will now share her God. There's such a huge lesson in these few verses. Guys, when we hide our pain, when we embrace dishonesty over authenticity, we diminish our witness. When we try to look strong, we project our strength instead of God's power to sustain us. We serve a God who has turned humanity's concept of power upside down. So why would we think we can attract others to the gospel message by undoing the humble, painful work of the cross? Paul reminds his readers in 2 Corinthians that he had been afflicted with what he calls a thorn in the flesh. We aren't told what the trial is, but we're told of his response. 2 Corinthians 12, 8 through 10. 3 times I appealed to the Lord about this, that it would leave me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. Everything in our culture tells us that we need to look successful. And oftentimes we try to emulate this in the church. We think that if we look like we have it all together, people will be drawn to us. But let's just be honest. People aren't looking for the church to intervene in their lives when everything's going well. And if they step into these doors to a church full of plastered on smiles, and if they're met with a gospel that's designed to make them think that the church is here because we have all the answers and we're their path to being healthy and wealthy and having a perfect marriage and poster perfect kids and no pain, then they're not going to stick around for very long because we're going to disappoint them for sure. I would venture to say that most of us are here today because at one point or another, we were Naomi in this story. And we walked into these doors like Naomi and Ruth walked back to Bethlehem, confused, tired, sad, and with no place else to go to seek to the answers of the big why questions. And we found answers here, not in the way we thought we would though. Instead, we found that God does sometimes empty us, like Naomi. But the difference we experience when we walk through these doors is that we learn that the process of emptying isn't the end goal. It's an anticipation for the fullness that we experience out of God's grace. You see, we can be like Naomi, distanced from our own belief system, but still knowing the loyal love of our God, the hesed. It's a word that we don't have a direct translation for, but it means goodness and kindness and loyalty that is unearned and freely given. It's the love that Ruth demonstrated to Naomi when Naomi was in her darkest days. And it's the love that God demonstrates to us over and over again as God works in the background of our lives when we have no idea that he's even there, but through our faith we know we're not alone. And this, all right, this is the remarkable example of, I love you, Ulysses. And this is the remarkable example of Naomi. Her faith was so strong, even in affliction, that it drew Ruth to God. Did Naomi follow all of God's rules? No. Did she have a deep understanding of her theology? Nope. Had she been faithful to the covenant and her people? Not really. Was she able to point to where God was guiding her and helping her? Not at this point. But was God still working on her behalf? Always. Yes. Was God still pushing her forward to redemption? Yes. And here's where the story is going to change. At this point of complete emptiness, at this point of complete dependence on God, this is where things turn around. How many of us have been there emptied and having no idea what's next? But the beauty of being emptied is that there is so much space to fill. One of the times in my life where I felt the most empty was when David and I moved our family down to downtown Milwaukee. We moved there because we wanted to work for a ministry that served that area. At that time, it was the fourth poorest zip code in the nation, so it was culture shock, but one that we looked forward to. They hired both David and I, and it only took about a month for me to realize I'd made a mistake. The work that I thought I'd been brought there to do wasn't possible to do. There was a host of problems that were well outside of my power to address. And while David continued to work, because there's always something for David to do, yeah, he was happy, it was great. It was apparent that my skills weren't going to be valuable in that setting. I was stunned. I thought God had called us there, but everything that was pointing to me being really wrong in that. In the adult class that we had here last Wednesday night, we talked a little about growing up in the church, and I mentioned how I grew up in a time when kids and youth groups were taught, not in the most theologically sound way, about God's perfect will and God's permissive will. And how I thought that if I was called by God, then it would be some kind of lightning bolt moment. I realize now that there's a kind of pride that's at work in thinking that if I was called by God, I'd be called in a way that would get rid of any doubt and make me feel special. But coming out of those youth groups, when I graduated from high school, I had decided to attend a cross-cultural ministries training school, only to discover after one semester that the area of ministry that I felt called to wasn't considered cross-cultural enough for that particular school. So that was one semester. But so before I ever went to Milwaukee, my history with following God's call had already primed me to feel like that experience in Milwaukee was another rejection from God. And while I still didn't feel the call to pastoral ministry at that time, moving into that place felt so much like I was on the right track that when it fell apart, all of that rejection came flooding back. But here's what came out of that experience. That job didn't work. So I started teaching at a secular college where I experienced firsthand the soul-crushing challenges that our young adults deal with every day in an economy that's nearly impossible to navigate, and with the pressures to our mental health that a culture driven by social media possesses. And I started teaching at a Christian high school, which, when compared to the secular college environment, revealed how the problems that the church is trying to solve with their young people, they don't match up to the problems experienced by the young people. I worked on my career as a writer. I decided to study theology because everything in my experiences wasn't adding up, and things simply didn't make sense. The experience really led me down a path of what a lot of people call deconstruction, but not in a bad way. I didn't question that God existed. I just wasn't convinced that a lifetime of training in what to believe was enough for me. I wanted to know why I believed it. So my deconstruction, the confusions I felt, and the underlying rejection that had chased me since high school sent me to seminary. While we were in Milwaukee, at that place that I felt like I should have never been there, I happened to meet the pastor who years later would be my mentor during the last year of seminary. He also happened to be the pastor of the church where I would eventually be called into a kind of ministry that required that I use all of those skills that I had learned during what had felt like pointless years without direction. The truth is, without those moments that felt like I was standing alone, without that fear of abandonment, without that sense of rejection, without learning the hard lesson that my only job as a Jesus follower is to follow, you'd think it'd be easier. I wouldn't be here today to tell whoever God has placed in these chairs who needs to hear it that your dark night has a purpose. And I don't mean this in the fake, happy platitude kind of way. I know how hard it is to hear, how hard it can be to hear to hear that when all you see is the pain. And I would love to tell you that you will eventually know purpose. But honestly, this side of the grave, you might not. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. You see, purpose for a Christian isn't about feeling like everything is complete. And it isn't about knowing that you're in the right place at the right time. It's not about being able to experience God's blessings as proof of the goodness of our efforts. It's not about being able to experience God's blessings as proof of our efforts. That's a hard one. Purpose for the Christian is simply about redemption. It's simply about the promise that what is meant for bad will be used for good. And this little story about Naomi that is under the title Ruth demonstrates that for us in two ways. First, we'll see God working on behalf of Naomi in the way that is most meaningful for her. He will work on behalf of her family, filling the places in her life that had been so brutally emptied. But second, we'll see God work through this family in ways that this family would have never been able to know. And that's what we'll talk about next week. But until then, I want us to stay in this place of uncertainty for a few moments so we can think about what our response needs to be when we're in a place when things look bad and they might not get better for a while. When we're in a place of being emptied and we don't know how God is going to fill the gaping hole that's been left by our circumstances. So I'm going to point out a few things from this story that are a comfort to us in the in-between times. The first one, and you can flip through these, it'll be one at a time. There we go. God uses our weaknesses. Naomi didn't do everything right. In fact, with her sons marrying Moabite women, she had done what was objectively wrong. But even in the hardship and despite the mistakes, God was still working in the background to redeem what had been lost. God didn't see her choices as a setback. This is a huge trap that we can fall into, thinking that God sees our mistakes as a setback to his greater plans. Guys, we don't have the power to throw God's plans off course. Our weakness is God's artistic medium. It's God's blank page. Next week, we're going to see how that works. The second thing, Is waiting is hard, but it's not pointless. Our timeline is rarely God's timeline. And just because it feels like we aren't making progress, it doesn't mean that progress isn't being made. The third thing is we're not alone. There are things to do when we're waiting. We return to our people. We go to church. It's not going to be perfect there, but you won't be alone. While God is working toward those long-term goals, God has provided a source of strength for us. It's our church family. We tend to want to isolate when things aren't going well. That's Satan talking. Don't listen to Satan. The fourth thing, it's okay to hurt. It's okay to be honest. It's okay to admit that we have no idea what God is up to, and the path is sometimes painful. You're not corrupting your witness by not being able to plaster on a fake smile. In fact, if we look at Naomi's example, when we're honest and authentic, that's something God can work with. We're not called to live as a perfect example. That's Jesus. We're called to walk in the steps of Jesus and try to copy his perfect example. Guess what? We'll make mistakes. So our witness isn't being perfect or acting perfect. It's in the peace that we project, because there is peace when we're following in the footsteps of our God. There's peace when we don't have to blaze the trail. There's peace when we can rest in the assurance that our shepherd knows the way. And the last thing is God's imagination is bigger than ours. This is what we'll get to see next week when we continue with the book of Ruth and the incredible redemption that rests in this simple story. Next week, we'll watch, through the eyes of Naomi and Ruth, we'll watch God use the powerless and the oppressed to overturn the social order and to transform the world. So what do we do today? I think we take a breath. I think like how the book of Ruth interrupts the huge stories of how an entire civilization is ruled by judges and then by kings, we take a minute to process that the pain experienced by one woman and our individual experiences are important enough to God to interrupt the story of the making of nations. Because the truth is that Jesus didn't die on a cross for nations. He died on the cross for you, and he died on the cross for me. Worship team, if you'd like to come back. So today we find ourselves in this story, and I think we empathize and lament the pain that needs to be acknowledged, and then we take the next step in the company of our church family, following the path that Jesus laid out. And I think we look forward to next week, both in our lives and in the lives of Naomi and Ruth. We look forward to seeing how God is going to use our circumstances just like he used theirs. And I think we rest in the security of that truth, that God is here in the everyday, not just to get us through, but to get us through with purpose. We rest in the truth that God doesn't rest. He's always at work. So today I want to close service not by asking for a show of hands for people who are struggling, because we all are in our own way. And if y'all didn't raise your hands, and I know you weren't being truthful, please stand. Today I want to close service by singing the blessing. Singing a blessing over all of us who are here this morning, and a blessing over the people who aren't here but maybe should have been, and a blessing over the people in our lives who are counting on our authenticity to help them see God's humble love for them.